I'm going to talk about productivity. Productivity is a major research interest of mine, and I could bore you with a lot of things about productivity, but we'll just spend just a little bit of time in talking about the importance of productivity and what productivity actually is. So first of all, it is fundamentally a measure of efficiency in the organization. What is effectiveness?
We learned it yesterday.
Effectiveness.
Yesterday in the evening you told us.
It has to do with how well we achieved our goals.
Yes.
Okay? Yes. So productivity now is concerned about the measure of efficiency in the organization. And it's really, if we think back to the systems model, it's the efficiency with which we take the inputs and make outputs. So how much waste do we have in terms of making a meal? So we start out with raw ingredients and we produce a meal, but how much waste was produced in that process? And so we can look at productivity as the ratio of output to input. So generally the input measure is labor. So we're looking at such things as meals per labor hour would be a measure of productivity. So in order to calculate that, you only need two things. You need the number of meals served in a given period of time, and you need to know how many labor hours were spent in that same amount of time. So divide meals divided by the number of hours, and you should get a number somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 10, somewhere in that neighborhood. It depends upon the kind of production system that you're using. It depends upon the number of staff that you have. It depends upon your menu. It determines by a lot of the decisions that we have been making. What your productivity rate is important to you. It's not necessarily important to somebody else. And what we want to do then is to look at our productivity ratio for the month of February, the month of March, the month of April, and so on, to see if there are any changes that are occurring in our level of productivity. How does this compare to what we were doing a year ago, 2 years ago, 10 years ago? But typically, we're looking at more recent data than that. What's happened within the last year? What is happening? What is going to happen in the coming year? So as we make changes in our menu, changes in our policies and procedures, changes in the way in which we staff our work, we're going to see changes in this productivity ratio. The last point that I have on the slide is that a suggestion that we need to have a family of productivity ratios rather than just one productivity ratio. And when I talk about a family of productivity ratios, I'm talking about a number of very similar kinds of things that we're going to be looking at. How many hours of time was spent by the equipment in producing the meals? I don't know if that would be of any value to somebody, but I think that it probably would be by the people who are involved in the use and maintenance of the equipment. So how many hours, that would be the input, and the output is the number of meals. There are some other measures that we can use as well that may fit into this category of a family of productivity. And that is, when we look at output of the system, particularly as we look at the output of the entire hospital system. What is a measure of the output of a hospital? You're a good one to answer that question.
I didn't understand it.
All right, I will ask it again.
Yes, please.
Okay. We talk about meals as being a output of the food service.
Yes.
But when we look at the hospital as a whole, what is a measure, what is an example of output?
The number of patients were, yes, good patients,
Okay.
healthy patients that leave the hospital.
Okay. That's the one that I was really looking for. But before I say that, I'm going to say something else, and then I'll come back to that. So, a patient day, a patient being in a hospital for one day or at least over midnight when the count is done, that is one measure of output. Is just a total number of patients in the hospital, whether they were dealt with or not. Hopefully they were dealt with. But the suggestion is made is, rather than just looking at the number of patients in the hospital, what about the number of patients that were discharged? The number of patients that went home? I often say the number of patients that were made well. Hopefully, that's our objective, is to make them well. So how many patients did we make well? And so that is a measure of output, and I think that is the ultimate measure of output. And so we can look then at amount of labor per discharge. We can look at the amount of food per discharge. We can look at the total cost of nutritional services, including dietitians and food service and all of the others in relationship to a patient discharge. And so that, to me, is probably one of the most clear definitions of productivity in a hospital setting, is that it is inclusive. It includes so much. That is a good example of a family of productivity measures. So it's going to not just be involved at the kind of production system that you have, even though it's going to affect that. We're really looking at the hospital as a whole, as a system. And I think that that is a good thing to do. I gave you an example of a productivity measure in terms of meals per labor hour. Profitability is another example of productivity, because we're looking at the amount of profit made per customer, per patient, whatever way we put our ratio together, whatever we're interested in. We can look at profitability. We can look at it in terms of profitability in the cafeteria, profitability in terms of vending machines. What does one employee contribute to the productivity? What does one employee contribute to the profitability within that organization? So this is an example of more parts of the family that we could consider. And the third one is, how many patients are served by each clinical dietitian? What is the amount of service that is provided to the patient? And so that is an output. If the dietitian was just sitting and not doing anything, just talking or just sitting around watching what's happening, are they being productive? No, they're not. And so that time that is spent in just sitting around, being idle, is going to affect this overall productivity in a negative way, because hours are accumulating but nothing is happening. And so that is something that we've got to consider when we are looking at staffing, when we're looking at some of these major decisions regarding what we're going to ask employees to do. Are they going to be productive? Are they going to contribute to the profitability of that organization? Now, we can look at the inverse of productivity. And so this is going to refer to the level of input per output. And so this inverse function then is useful in helping us to determine the requirements of staff, equipment, food, whatever, for us to achieve our goal. So if we have an inverse of productivity, like the third one, hours of labor per patient day. So you give me the number of patient days, and I can tell you the amount of staff that you need to accommodate those patients based upon this relationship or this ratio that we have at the third step, the hours of labor per patient day. And then when we talk about cost per patient discharge, as we were, that is frankly not a productivity measure, but it's more of inverse because we're looking at cost, which is input, and patient discharge as an output. So it's just the reversal of that ratio. Still a valuable ratio, and the comments that I made are most, I think, appropriate, but it can help us then in determining resources that we're using to achieve our goal. So why are we even interested in productivity? One of the reasons is that a study and evaluation of productivity is going to help us in reducing the total cost within that organization. So if we know how our resources are being used, we can be then very appropriate in terms of hopefully lowering cost. We can maximize the efficiency of equipment use is another benefit. But I think probably the most important reason why we study productivity is efficient use of labor and leading to job satisfaction. Have you ever been in a situation, kind of as I was demonstrating here a moment ago, when you don't have anything to do? You ever have that luxury?
No.
Nothing to do? And so you just sit. Or your skills are not being used to the highest potential that you have. Are you going to feel satisfied in that job? No, not at all. Because you have so much more potential that is not being used. So studying productivity of an individual can help very much in terms of creating a great deal more satisfaction amongst the employees than what we otherwise would have. I'm going to just let that stay up there for a moment. And I want to talk with you what seems like maybe another thing, but it's really talking about productivity. And this is a whole area called work measurement. Work measurement is a way in which you can study a job. And I have done a lot of work measurement in my past. And where we have, in one case, one research study that we did, we were interested in determining the amount of time and the amount of cost associated with preparing and serving a modified meal to a patient. So this meant that we followed a recipe from the very beginning all the way to the point at which it was served to the patient. Those were the limits of our study. And so the process that we used was a work sampling approach. Work sampling is the establishment of random times. And at the precise moment of that time, you take a mental picture of what was happening in the work area. And you record that on your sheet. You're making an observation every 2 to 3 minutes, but again at random times. And you write down the work function that that individual was doing and who that individual was. Then we can go back and look at the labor cost for that individual. So in that way we can determine the total labor cost. We knew what the food cost was from the menu and from the analysis of the cost of each of the ingredients going on into the recipe and then into the menu. So through not elaborate, but time-consuming effort, we were able to answer that question as to what was the cost associated with preparing a modified meal. So the kind of work functions that we were looking at were 3. The first one was pre-production, or let me start over. It was direct work function, which involved pre-production and production. It also involved the second broad category of work functions, which had to do more with inspection and evaluation. And the third area that we looked at was delay or idle time. And in this research project, one of the things that we saw coming out of that was some statistics that I shared with you the other day in terms of 1/3 of the time that the cook spent in pushing a trolley around was an empty trolley. They were not really doing anything. But, if you were just walking through and you saw a cook pushing a trolley, you may not think about it. But when you look at it in terms of a whole, you find that, wow, that is just a lot of time that is being wasted by the employee. The work sampling is a process that is very similar to time-lapse photography. Do you know what I'm talking about, time-lapse photography? You have seen it. Each and every one of you have seen it. It may be a picture of a rose, and in just a few moments it goes from a bud to a full open flower. Or I have seen them where a picture is taken once a day and in terms of building a building. And so the building just comes out of the ground and develops into a full skyscraper in just a few seconds, but it took many years to do that. So work measurement through work sampling or direct work measurement where you're standing with a watch and you are watching how long it takes an employee to do a task. That is another approach. That is a work measurement technique, but not a work sampling. It's a direct method of determining time spent. So these are ways in which we can look at and measure productivity as well. So direct work is the primary thing that we're looking at. That is work that is directly associated with making the meal. So we look at the proportion of delay time to the total time, the inspection time to the total, and direct time to the total. And hopefully we're going to see something in the neighborhood of between 85 and 90% productivity on the part of the employees. Sometimes it'll be less, sometimes it's more. But those are pretty well the center of where the data comes out is about 85 to 90%. One of the reasons that it is so low is that when an employee is given a break, they're still being paid, and so we're still monitoring the fact that they are being paid but are on an authorized work break. But if they're not on an authorized work break, then that's where we need to take some corrective action, I think. Let's talk about peeling potatoes. Does that sound all right? Let's say that you give one of your employees a sack of 50 kilos of potatoes. And you give them a little hand potato peeler and they begin peeling the potatoes. How long is it going to take them to do that? It depends on how motivated the employee is. And yeah, okay.
For example, my husband is peeling potatoes 3 times quicker.
Okay. All right, so that is one thing. Now, you provide, in another setting, a mechanical potato peeler for your employee. How long is it going to take at that time to peel the 50K of potatoes? Much, much less time. Are you able to buy potatoes already peeled?
No.
Institutionally, I'm sure that you can buy potatoes already peeled. Not for the home, but for the institution. You pay a premium price for it, but you can buy them. So if we were to look at the productivity of each of these 3 scenarios, the hand peeler, the mechanical peeler, or buying the potatoes already peeled, which is most productive? Yeah, exactly. And when we talk then about the productivity of an employee who is just taking such a long time to do the job, well, it could very well be that the employee is only as productive as the manager will allow them to be. Allow them to be in terms of the equipment that they give to them. So, what we're really talking about is the willingness of the manager to be productive. What we're going to do is to exchange a tool, a bigger tool, a more expensive tool, for that potato peeler. Let me tell you another story. Several years ago, I was in China, and we were taken to one of the sacred mountains of China. And as we were driving up the mountain, we encountered road construction. Road construction was done like this. There must have been 1,000 Chinese people out there working. Many of them were with a shovel and a pick and bigger stones. They were putting them along the curb, making a curb for the road. And then further down in a wash, do you know what I'm talking about? Where water runs, but there's no water right now. Okay? What they were doing is, with hammers, they were breaking up those rocks into smaller pieces. And then they had a basket that was about this wide and about this deep, and then it had an edge on it that was about that much on 3 sides. And so they were using it like a little shovel to pick up that gravel and to carry it and to put it in the roadway where it was smoothed. Where we were driving on this road, it was very nice. It was a very high quality road. It had not been tarred yet. There was no real hard surface, but it was a gravel rock surface and was very good. So I was amazed at the productivity of those individuals because it took so many thousand people to do the job, and they were only going a few meters a day. We continued driving, and that was left behind. And just around the corner was a very large Caterpillar tractor that had a scoop in the front of it that could have done the work of all of those 1,000 Chinese people in a very short time. What was the difference in terms of productivity? One of the questions that I need to ask myself really is, if those Chinese people were put out of work by that tractor, what are the economic situations that are going to result from that? I think we need to look at productivity from a number of different points of view to really make appropriate decisions regarding the kind of equipment that we provide to our employees to do their job. So, productivity is a relatively easy concept. It's easy to calculate. And so given any kind of operational data, like meals served, hours worked, staffing levels, whatever, you can calculate the productivity by looking at the output divided by the amount of input that it took to make that meal, to make that specific output. Okay, this is about where we were going to start at 3 o'clock. So I think we're coming along just fine, though. I'd like to transition now to another topic of motivation. We talked a little while ago about the obligation that the manager has to create an environmental situation where an employee can be motivated. A question that I would like to ask you is, can you as a manager motivate an employee?
Money.
Again, please?
Using money.
Using money. Oh, so money is the main motivating factor? So the more money that you pay, the more the motivation?
If you underpay them, they will say, "You're for that money, it doesn't even, I don't know."
I would do the same way. Yeah, I would respond in exactly the same way. If you're not giving me very much money, I'm not going to work for you. I'm going to go somewhere else. How long does that last?
Till the next promotion.
Yes, that's right. How soon does that come? Not soon enough, probably. So, the manager's role in the motivation of employees is often not what we think it is or what it should be. The manager needs to create an environment where the employee is going to be motivated. And so when I talk about creating an environment, it's not about paying money. It's not about the way that we necessarily treat our employees, but it is the way in which we relate to our employees and the way that we recognize and reward our employees in typically non-monetary ways. Now, there are as many motivation theories as there are people, it seems. And so you're going to have to evaluate my motivational theories, which is really just one. But there's Probably the most simple one is that of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Are you familiar with that one? That we really achieve motivation when we get to the self-actualization level. The first levels of physiological and safety have to do with just continuity of life. But when we get to the area of self-actualization, we're beginning to see then about motivation. But the one that I would like to spend just a few moments on is Herzberg's two-factor theory of motivation. And he divides factors up into two categories. The first one that we will talk about is the one on the right, which are hygiene factors. Pay is number one on that. The second is supervision, job security, working conditions, policy of the organization, the interrelationships on the job. If the pay is bad, as we were talking about, I'm out of here. I'm not going to work. I'm dissatisfied and I'm gone. What if the pay is good? Am I really going to be motivated? Am I really creating that environment, or is that environment being created for me where I'm going to be really, really happy to work because I get just a fantastic salary? Have you ever gotten a raise? Have you ever gotten, you paid one thing and then you get an increase in pay? How long does it take for that to wear away, that you never have enough money to buy the things that you really, really want? So pay is important, there's no question about it. But after a while, it begins to lose its power. Just like all of these other things. When we have any one of those factors on the right-hand side, when they are very, very good, things are happy for a while. And it may be a long time or a short time. But if the pay is good, if the supervision is good, does that mean that I'm going to really be satisfied on my job? Probably not. It may happen in the short term, but definitely not in the long term. Now, let's go across the border here to motivators. And Herzberg indicates that in his research that he has found some real motivation occurring when management recognizes the achievement of what an employee has done. And so achievement is one. Recognition, the fact that you are recognized as being important, is a motivating factor. It creates that nice warm fuzzy feeling inside that you have done something and it has been recognized as being contributing to the organization. It may be the responsibility that you have, the level of responsibility that's going to be motivating for you. The ability to be advanced, to grow within the organization. Not that a situation where you're ready to be advanced, they bring in someone over you from outside that doesn't have anywhere near the skill that you have. But that is pretty well going to cut any motivation right there. The work itself. How has that job been created so that the employee is going to be really happy and motivated? And what is the potential for growth? These are some examples of real motivating factors that create a positive attitude in the workplace. I have seen in a number of situations where individuals who practice these motivating influences come up with a staff that is so positive and so happy in working together, creating a really positive corporate culture. And so it is the management's philosophy of management that I think really is going to do this, to create this management, to create this motivating environment. That's what I think is probably a better way to say it. I wanted to give you an example of this whole area of motivation. I did my graduate study in the state of Missouri, St. Louis area, Kansas City area. I don't know how much you know about Missouri. Probably not very much. The bottom half of the state is hills. And the people who live in those hills are low educated. No, they're not very well educated. They have been used to getting by with very, very little money. And so they just exist out there in the hills. They grow much of their own food. And they also, the money that they get comes from state and federal support for them. Because of these conditions, many companies have moved into this area because they want employees, and they want employees that are not going to cost very much. These employees are willing to work for very little money. So a particular company comes to that area of the state, and they begin hiring people. And they announce the date at which all of the employees will come to work and will begin working. Nobody showed up. You know, there were a few, but not everybody. There was very few people who came. And so management scratched their head and said, you know, what can we do to motivate these employees to come to work? Well, first of all, remember that management cannot motivate the employees. But after a few weeks, someone got a bright idea. Why don't we give them all an alarm clock? And so they can set the alarm so that they can be to work on time. Did that help? No, not at all. People were still absent. They were still not there on time. So they considered other things. Someone came up with the idea that we'll give everyone a catalog of goods. You get catalogs in the mail here. And so, you know, that would be nice to have. You know, I could use some of that. And so the thought was that if we could show these people that they have the potential for getting all of these other things, that maybe they would come to work. Did that work? It did. It really did. People were there and they were working because they had now a purpose, that they were going to earn enough money to buy that thing that they wanted. So this is an industrial application of the theories of motivation to get people to come to work. The individual that told me that I learned that in class, and the teacher was involved in this process down in the southern part of the state. There are ways in which we can motivate or create an environment where the individual will work. Another area that we need to talk about is leadership. Leadership is the process by which we influence the activities of individuals or groups of individuals toward achieving common goals. And I don't look at that as the best definition of leadership, but I think it correctly communicates what we want. But what really is a leader? What does a leader do? And there's an aspect of that as influencing activities. So a leader is going to be involved in creating that environmental factors of motivation so that an individual will follow, will do what is expected. And so from a formal way of leadership, we can talk about people following an individual that we will call a leader because of their legitimate power. That is, they are the boss, and so we need to follow them and to recognize them as a leader. Or we may recognize them as a leader because they can reward us, reward me in some way. Or I will follow because of some coercion, a stick that's going to beat me on the back to get me to work, to follow this individual. Not too many of these have been influential in my life in following an individual. Expert power, maybe a little bit of that as far as my own life is concerned. I will follow an individual who seems to know what to do. We're going to look at that again in just a few moments. Sometimes a person with charisma will be followed because of their ability to clearly communicate, and they're a nice personality, and we want to be associated with them. We also will follow an individual who has information. Now, there's not an awful lot of difference, I think, between expert power and information. But someone may be an expert but not really have current information. So, if you're out in a situation and the expert seems to know everything but doesn't have current information in terms of maybe where we are if we're lost, maybe someone with a GPS system would tell us where we are. And so that information then could be fed to the individual with expert power so that we would follow them. But the person with the information can also be a leader. And then individuals who have connection with others who may be more powerful, we may follow them as well. Now, there are some assumptions that leaders make in terms of working with employees. One of them is theory X. This is a negative theory in saying that employees will not naturally work. What we've got to do is to coerce them in some way to work. And so it may be a threat of punishment, of fear that we create in their mind to say, you better work or else. Theory X is also saying that we really need to provide incentives, and it may be negative incentives, punishment, in order to get people to do what we want them to do. Theory Y, on the other hand, is the opposite, saying that employees are self-directed, they are willing to work, they want to work, and they're going to do the very best job possible. In my class a number of years ago, we tested this theory. And it would have been fun to do that here today, but we don't have all the resources I think that we need. We divided the class up into two groups and put them in different rooms. I gave each of the groups a whole stack of paper, and we made paper airplanes. And there were several designs of these paper airplanes. And at the beginning of each production period, the employees would be told the number of each type of airplane that they needed to make. Now, in the Theory X group, the chairman of our department at that time was the leader. And she came in and was very much a dictator. and saying, this is what we're going to do. No input from the work group at all, and said that in the next 10 minutes I want each of you to produce 40 paper airplanes of this design. No ifs, ands, or buts. Oh, and the name of our company is. That's it. And so the productivity of that group in terms of paper airplanes made was very, very high. Really good. Comparing that to Theory Y, which says that employees will naturally work. And so there was a great deal of time spent by the students in developing a company name, in developing specialization. What kind of airplane can you make versus the kind of airplane that you can make? And so those are the airplanes that will be made. There is some communication as to what styles are needed and what numbers. And so looking at the first production period, they did not produce very much at all. It was pretty poor. The second production period was a little bit better because they were organized now and things were going well. But by the time we got to the third production period, the Theory X group was really getting upset. They were talking about forming unions. They were talking about going on strike. They were talking about walking off the job. They were tired of this environment. And this was natural from coming within, because people were behaving in the way in which management perceived them that they needed to be dealt with. So in the Theory X group, productivity was high and then it just curtailed. In the Theory Y group, productivity began low but began to build. So it had an organization that was quite sustainable, where it was not the case in Theory X. There has been a lot of study that has been put into leadership. And there was a lot of effort when I was beginning my career as to looking at personality traits that made good leaders. And I can remember memorizing, I think, more than 21 different personality traits that would make me a better leader. Did it make me a better leader? No, not at all. Sorry about that. But the leadership trait exercise is pretty well gone. We're really asking the questions, what can we do to help an individual to become a better leader? And we're saying then that every individual can be a leader. But what kind of a leader? There are at least 3 different kinds of leaders that we can categorize a leader into. One is a democratic type of a leader. Another one is an autocratic kind of a leader. And the third is a laissez-faire kind of a leader. Do you know the difference between all of those? You understand those words? Democratic, okay, where the individuals that they lead will follow them. Autocratic, a dictator, this is what you're going to do, no questions asked. And a laissez-faire is saying, this is the work that needs to be done, do it. Not a lot of involvement on the part of the leader. So what is the effectiveness of each of these 3 styles of leadership? I think it's pretty well exhibited in what we were just talking about in the Theory X and the Theory Y of management, because Theory X really had to be involved in a autocratic, dictatorial style in order to get anything done. So there's not a lot of effort put into studying these 3 methods as well. There has been a fair amount of allegiance and recognition of this research of the leadership grid, which is looking at two dimensions. The Y dimension has to do with concern for people. I could not turn my font around so that I could put it up along the side there. And so the X-axis has to do with concern for production. So it's either people or it's production. Or maybe it can be both. So if we have 0 or close to 0 concern for people, and we have almost 0 concern for production or productivity, that level is referred to as an impoverished leader or an impoverished manager. They're not doing anything. They're not doing their job. But as we go up the y-axis to the extreme, the upper limit, we get to the country club kind of a leader. Do you know what a country club is? It is a social group. They may play golf, they may play tennis, and if you were to ever go on a cruise, there is a social director on the cruise, and their purpose is to help you to feel comfortable in everything that you do. That's a country club manager. What can I do to make you more comfortable? What can I do to provide you for games and entertainment? I'm not concerned about production. I'm concerned about making you as happy as possible. Now, let's look along the X-axis. If we are entirely concerned about production, we are dealing with high levels of authority and assurance that you are obeying what I tell you to do. So we're going to get this job done no matter what. Now there is, in the middle of the road kind of leader. I'm not going to go all out for production. I'm not going to go all out for people. But we'll just try to be satisfied with the way things are right now. That's a middle of the road. You know, we get some production done. People are fairly happy, but not as much happy as what they could be. Then in the top right-hand quadrant of this management grid is high concern for people, high concern for production. And what we have here is what is referred to as a team manager, a team leader, an individual who is going to involve the team in making decisions and being involved in the control of the operation. And so that's where we're going to see the highest productivity and the highest satisfaction among our employees.